Okay, welcome everybody. Welcome to this first afternoon session, the session on finding the threat and ways to respond. Now, every year when we are putting together the program for CyCon and selecting the papers to publish in our book, there are a number of papers that are quite difficult to put into a clearly defined theme or topic. And so these are basically the orphans or the familyless articles we're struggling to find a good place for. And this is this session. But actually, when you look closer at it, this is very much an all-encompassing session, because when you think what is important to do as nations in response to the threat in cyberspace, the first thing you have to do is define the threat. And that's where Steve comes in, who has done a research on the likelihood of terrorist organizations using cyberspace for launching attacks. So he will talk about the threat. When you've defined the threat, you will have to inform your nation, your population about this threat, and you could find a way to do this properly. And that's where Sean comes in, because he's been doing research into the cyber doom effect of how you can oversell the threat and thereby diminish the effectiveness of your policies by misinforming your population. So that's where you come in about your response. And if you've done that, you've got to figure out as a nation, well, what strategies and policies do we need to develop to effectively counter the threat? And that's where Lior comes in, who will be speaking about the Israeli approach to cybersecurity, about the Israeli strategy, and about the ways the policy is implementing the strategy. So all in all, we have a very holistic session here, and afterwards you'll be informed about all aspects of cybersecurity. So this is basically the whole CyCon event in one condensed 1.5 hours. So having raised the bar for you, I don't want to increase the pressure on you, but please, inform us all about it. Steve, floor is yours. Steve is a lead investigator and senior researcher in the Unconventional Weapons and Technology Division of the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism at the University of Maryland. And the acronym is START. So please, start.
Thank you, Mathis. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Steve Sen. As Mathis said, I'm from the University of Maryland. And I have a unconcerted effort to advertise my center at the end of the presentation. And so we'll talk about what we actually do a little bit at the end of my presentation. So a little bit of expectation management. It says determining the extremist organization's likelihood of conducting cyber attacks. What I would like to tell you is that this particular research is at its infancy, and this paper is about the first stage of the research that we have been conducting. And we are currently in the phase 2 of the research. And we'll talk about a little bit of that at the end of the presentation. So the first 4 bullets that you see on that slide are some of the things that you will see if you read any of the technical magazines or technical journals every day. So that is actually where we started our work, because we were looking at all these things, and I was actually hoping that Sean was going to go first so that I can dovetail off of his thing and say, hey, look, there's this hype thing going on. But unfortunately, that was not the case. I'll just make the case for him. And so we said, hey, look, there's all these cyber activities going on, and apparently we talk about things like Cyber Pearl Harbor, Cyber Armageddon. In fact, we talked about a little bit of that in the criminalization of cyber attacks panel yesterday. But I'm a terrorism researcher, and I had a problem. On a completely unrelated topic or unrelated research, what was completed about a year ago, we were tasked with tracking active terrorist organizations throughout Europe, Northern Africa, and Western Africa. And between 2008 and 2012, we have identified 143 terrorist organizations that had at least conducted one attack in those regions. Now here's my conundrum. If you have 143 organizations conducting terrorist attacks in 5-year span, why is ISIS the only one that's on the news about cyber attacks? And if the media is correct, and if our open source reporting is correct, then we should see some more organizations trying to do this. And we don't quite see that many. So that was one of our questions. So that's the question. Why aren't violent extremist organizations, and we included the term violent extremist organization, not necessarily just terrorists, to broaden our research scope. And we said, why aren't they using cyber attacks as much as they possibly could be doing? And we weren't as such interested in, well, are they doing things like SCADA attacks or infrastructure attacks or destructive attacks? We were actually interested in everything from things like DDoS, website defacing, all the way up to something that's kinetically involved. And we see quite a small amount of that. We actually don't see a lot at all. So, of course, we dove into the literature and we said, well, there are certain reasons that you want to go online, right? Cyber has been dubbed as somewhat of a David versus Goliath story. If you're the David, cyber is a good way to beat the Goliath. Well, okay. And also, a lot of the terrorism research has shown that terrorist organizations or extremist organizations have gone online to evade the law enforcement efforts, which is true. A lot of the recruitment happens online now, actually almost all of it. A lot of the command and control happens online. So, those are all the good reasons why they need to actually use the cyber mechanism to conduct their business every day. But it's also the same medium they can use to attack, but they have not done so. So we were wondering why that was. And of course, the assessment, from the literature anyway, from the assessment that the primary reason that people should go online are things like non-attribution and ease of purchasing the cyber weapons, or things like, well, we have these kits now, so you don't necessarily have to be the coder, you just go buy the kits. Well, okay. So those were the assessments, but they were not jiving with what we were seeing, at least anecdotally, from our research center. So here are some of the reasons that the literature says this is why they don't go online. The first three are pretty simple, right? Well, terrorists want to incite fear. How do you do that online? Or achieving your political end goals, how do you do that online? And then the best one, I think, actually for me, is the visualization of destruction, right? Something needs to blow up. Terrorists love things blowing up. Well, it's not very sexy, if you will, in the American terms, to have some guy sitting on a computer screen. That's not a good recruitment video. So, but relatively speaking, you can do things to incite fear. You don't necessarily have to destroy anything to incite fear. So one of the things that I was talking to Mathis about as we were going back and forth on editing our paper, and thank you very much for your great comments, by the way, was that, look, imagine, and ISO has already done some of this. Imagine a case where they hack into the NATO database and they steal personnel information from NATO. And oh, by the way, and one of my colleagues is such case, is that, she loves Facebook. And you can basically track her entire movement throughout the day using Facebook. So if I have the personnel information from NATO, I have her Facebook, it does not take a genius to figure out what she does, who her families are, sorry, Rob, and all the other pertinent detail for you to actually do something to her. Now, they don't actually necessarily do anything to her. All they have to do is release this information and say, hey, look, we have your information, and we want to go kill you. So for us in NATO, this may not be a big deal, right? We're all in this business. Well, if this gets released to, for example, my country's Fox News, that will be a bad day. The Sean will probably end up talking about that kind of effect. So it is relatively easy to do if you can imagine these kind of scenarios. It's nothing that nears cyber Armageddon or cyber Pearl Harbor, but it's something that they can do. It's within their feasibility. Now, there are disruption versus destruction questions in the literature about, well, you know, cyber attacks are usually for disruption rather than destruction. Well, okay, well, terrorists can do either one, they can still achieve their objective. So that's not necessarily really the reason why they shouldn't do it. The other thing really is the difficulty of attribution, right? So one of the advantages of using internet is that you cannot get attributed to it. Well, except you're a terrorist, which means you want to claim that you did it. So this is in direct conflict with their actual interest, and maybe that's why they don't do it. That may be the case. And then we also, of course, have the cost versus the cost issue. Material that's needed to do all this, personnel, except we kind of have to change our conceptualization in this case when we talk about cost factors, because we were sitting there thinking about things like, well, you know, if this was a state actor doing all this, in the case of the United States, most of these, and most of the countries, most of these are clandestine operations. We don't actually know, as a public, we don't know who or what capabilities we actually have and what the government is planning on doing next. And we spend millions of dollars training our force to do cyber attacks, cyber defense, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, in the case of terrorists or extremist organizations, the calculus has to change because, you know, I don't have to have my own NSA secure program to do this if I'm an extremist organization. I can just outsource all that. But that is still a cost because that is an operational security issue for the terrorist organization. How can you trust your third party to actually do what you want them to do and be secure about it? So that could be one of those things. And then, of course, the sustainability issue. Terrorists are not, or extremist organizations are not necessarily looking for things like APT type events, right? They don't want to do persistent surveillance on a target. They want something, and if they're going to do that, they only do it for a medium-term duration so that they can get a quick turnaround and something that's very explosive and very disruptive in the public. So it's not, APT is something not to their interest. So we had all these literature that says, yes, this is why you want to go online. No, this is why you don't want to go online. But here was still the question was, no, there was no systematic research that was done that says, why do they or why don't they do it? Is it the capability issue? Is it that it's just not them? They just don't want to do it? But we still don't know. So that drove our thing. So since there was no other systematic research that we could base this upon, so we decided on a three-phase approach. The phase one was we have in START, that's the acronym for our center, because if I actually spelled out the thing, it's 2 lines long. So at START, we have accumulated a large amount of database on terrorist activities, terrorist organizations, and we have a profile for them. So we decided we can use some of those profiles, some of those variables that we use in those profiles to see if we can get a start on building the internet side or the cyber side of these profiles. As phase 2 then will be collecting the information and coding them. And then the phase 3 obviously is to actually do the empirical regression or whatever methodology that we will use to analyze the results. And so this paper actually is some of the interesting results that we found from the phase 1 of this entire research. And primarily what we did was we did a survey research, and from the survey we actually did contact some of the participants to get some more detailed thoughts, why they think that was the case, and here are some of our impressions. So first and foremost, these are all the variables that we asked them from our profiles. There are in 4 different categories, and I apologize for the small prints. And I think, someone worked. So we have the organizational factors, resource factors, sophistication. This is where you ask things like, is the organization technically sophisticated? Have they shown tactical sophistication, et cetera, et cetera? And then obviously you have prior activities factors. So these do not necessarily ask. We added prior history of cyber attack. This was something that we added. Currently, we in the profiles have things like, does the organization have a history of violent extremism or a violent attack? Well, if you're in an extremism database or violent extremist database, the answer is yes, but we wanted to know what the experts thought, if that actually attributed to them being cyber active or not. And we ended up administering our survey to about 300 people. This is not necessarily a very random sample, because what we ended up doing was it was a ballooning sample. So, you know, me and our START consortium know so many people, and then they said, oh, hey, these guys are doing this research, this is great, why don't you guys do it too? And we ended up about 300 people. About 18.67% return rate, that's actually in a survey research. That is an outstanding return rate, believe it or not. And that actually gets us about 56 people. Not a terribly large sample, so it's not an empirical case yet. It's, you know, somewhat anecdotal, but we can still do this. So there are three groups. You have obviously all participants, 56, and then we were lucky enough to have about 50%. I think it was somewhere breaking down into 51%, 48%, 51%, or 52% technical participants, and 48% or so that was non-technical. Non-technical meaning we're policy folks like me. I'm a political scientist by training. I'm actually an international relations person, so that turned to this way. My advisor still calls me that I turned to the dark side. So non-technical persons are folks like me, and then technical folks that are one of our co-authors who's actually a coder and things like that. And then obviously we got them divided up into public sector, which is primarily government, private sector, who works in the private companies, and then the academia. So, very small slide. This is not intended for you to read, but the bottom line is, interestingly enough, there were some consistencies between just the straight survey results, and we did a quantitative result run of the survey, and it seems everybody thinks the key is the human resource, whether you have it within the organization or you have the ability to go out and reach out to somebody and say, hey, can you do this for me? Which seemed to make sense to me. It's like, okay, that seems to make sense. What was interesting to us actually was that in the survey, one of the things that we also asked the participants was, are there variables that you would think that we had to not ask you that you want to add? And the answer was actually, we didn't get any of that. And then there were also some questions that we asked, are there variables that you think it's worthless? We should not ask this question. And actually, to my very pleasant surprise, we did not have to throw out any variables or add any variables, actually. But some of the interesting findings were where the discrepancies were between the different groups as we broke down the analysis. So the technical group seems to think that the consensus was that there were consensus between the groups about activity factors. So everybody seems to think that if you have shown the propensity to conduct violent extremist activities, that could drive you to do things. Because at the end of the day, maybe that is something that is the most important thing for you to achieve your end goal. So it's like what we talked about yesterday in the criminalization panel. It is about, at the end of the day, what is most effective to achieve your goal. So maybe that was it. And we thought, well, that was pretty neat. What's not on there actually was that we found something that was very interesting. So in the terrorism research area, ideology usually shows up as one of the highest things to determine motivation and intent of organizations. Oddly enough, the technical folks in our case said ideology was very important. The non-technical side actually said ideology, who cares about ideology? Which is in complete contradiction with our terrorism research that's been going on, which I thought was very interesting. I will still have to investigate why that actually happened, but that's another research question. And then the findings for when you broke out different subgroups. And the ones in the red lines are what each group thought was important. And so what's really interesting to me is the difference between private sector and everybody else. So the private sector, the companies, the folks that were working in the companies thought the most important thing really is the networking ability of the organization, which actually is congruent with a lot of the terrorism research. So if you know someone that's doing the cyber attack, and if you know how to get there, if you have a network available to you, you can use that network to serve your own purposes. That's what the private sector was thinking about, while the private and academic, or public and the academic sector were thinking about things like leadership organization structures and the and things like, what was the, innovation, or no, wait. Leadership structures and organizational composition, organizational size. So those were the things that we were talking about in public and academia. Now, so what was shown really is maybe something that we kind of knew about, that we kind of heard in our background about, oh, you know, I can't talk to those coders because we just talk past each other. Well, this actually kind of shows some of that going on in between these subgroups, but there were some congruencies as well that was found that we were like, oh, that's kind of nice, that we actually have some common ground. Also, what we did find is that internally between the groups, within the group, with what we call the within group congruency is very high. So everybody in the academia thinks the same way. Everybody in the private sector thinks pretty much the same way. Everybody in the government pretty much thinks the same way, regardless if you're technical or non-technical. It's probably because what we're doing every day and what we're faced with every day is different. But since there are some congruencies, there are some things that we can start off our conversations with. And that is one of the important things that we found is that, yeah, all groups exhibit internal congruencies, and you can actually have a conversation about the differences and why you have differences. And so based off of this data, what we ended up doing was that we incorporated all the comments. We incorporated some of the cyber activities variables that we asked our panel into what the START already has in existence, called the Big, Bad, and Dangerous data set, or BAD. Yes, again, political science cannot do anything without acronyms, just like the military. So I did a great transition from the US Army. Acronym to acronym is great. And then, so that particular data set that we used have 142 insurgency/violent extremist organizations on it between 1998 and 2012. Over the last 6 months or so, so between the time this paper was submitted and now, we collected and coded all those data. And this summer, we'll collect 2013 and 2015 data for the data set. And what was very surprising, there was not a lot of variances in dependent variable, meaning there was not a lot of attacks like as we thought. But what was actually surprising was that the early trends seemed to point to perhaps we need to think about not just the threat, but also the target. So for example, if you're a terrorist organization in Rwanda, cyber attack's not going to get you anywhere. What are you going to attack? Okay, so you attack the Rwandan government, but that's not necessarily going to do anything. But if you're attacking Israel, cyber attack may be the thing to do. So perhaps, so we were focused on this from the threat perspective, but the early trends, and this is very anecdotal because we have not done the completed collection and analysis yet, but the early trends seem to say, well, you know, threat is important, but target is also important. What are you going after? And in a very short period of time, and this is a unconcealed advertisement of the center. So we are actually a DHS Center of Excellence, just like CCCOE. CCD COE. It's like, so we are similar to you in that sense. We are based at University of Maryland, and we have about 75 research and staff at our headquarters. Plus, it's a consortium, so we have about relations with about 50 academic and institutions across the world and in the United States. And what's listed there are primarily what we do, and cyber is something that we are getting into, but we only do it from, and we are a social science center, so you know, my partner is a social psychologist and et cetera, so we actually do cyber from the social aspects. We kind of try to figure out why people do what they do, because there is a person behind that screen at the end of the day. So thank you very much. And
Thank you, Steve. I think we're going to do the questions and answer round at the end, so no question now. But I think, Steve, there is an opportunity to submit another paper for the CyCon US section, call for papers that's going on now. So,
Yes,
there might
we
be,
were
just one of
actually
you.
talking about that.
Okay, good, good. Steve, please, can you, floor is yours. Steve will talk about his paper, The Cyber Doom Effect, the impact of fear appeals in the US cybersecurity debate. Sorry, Sean, I'm sorry. Sean, Sean Lawson is an associate professor in the Department of Communication at the University of Utah.
If I need a laser,
Yeah.
it's the middle button, so nobody get out of line. If you fall asleep, you're getting lasered. Okay. All right. So let's see. Is it this one? Oh, shoot. Yeah. Good job. Already messing up the clicker. All right, so thank you for having me today. My name is Sean Lawson. I'm associate professor in the Department of Communication at the University of Utah in the United States. I've been writing about issues of cybersecurity for quite a few years now. I have a handful of peer-reviewed articles on the topic, working on a book for Routledge about the rhetoric of the public policy debate in cybersecurity in the United States. Right now, it should be out next year. And I've served as a peer reviewer for papers for this conference since about 2010, actually. But this is my first time presenting at the conference, so I'm happy to be here. The work I'm presenting today was actually carried out along with a couple of co-authors, so Dr. Sarah Yo, assistant professor in communication at Utah, as well as two of our students at Utah, Hao-Ran Yu and Ethan Green. So I'll start my talk by defining what we mean by cyber doom in our paper. It's a rhetorical phenomenon that I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, as it's an ongoing feature, unfortunately, of our public policy discourse about cybersecurity in the US, and I suspect probably some other countries as well. I'll then talk about our particular research questions, the steps that we took to answer those questions, what we found, and some implications of this for how we communicate about and think about and talk to one another, in particular wider publics and policymaker audiences, about the cyber threat. Okay, so let's start off with just defining the key phenomenon that we're talking about here in our paper. So what do we mean by cyber doom? Well, cyber doom refers to the tendency of some in the debates that we have about cyber conflict to warn of ever-impending doom scenarios in which cyber attacks do things like crash the power grid, transportation systems, financial networks, and more. The ultimate impacts in these scenarios often include the collapse of entire societies and economies, what I like to call the sort of Lord of the Flies impact, right? A cyber attacker takes down the power grid, and wouldn't you know it, within just hours, we're all beating each other in the streets because society just completely falls apart. So we see traffic in such warnings is quite common, especially, I think, among officials, but I think there's more work to be done to try to pin down exactly who's responsible for perpetuating this rhetoric. Perhaps most infamous in recent years, though, is Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta's 2012 description and warning about an impending cyber Pearl Harbor. We probably all remember that. But of course, he's not the only one, right? These warnings have been with us for a long time, all the way back to 1991, and when Schwartau's warning about a digital Pearl Harbor in computer world, and then in his testimony to Congress. One of the reasons why we undertook this research is because these warnings continue to this day. The image on the slide here graced the cover of The Economist magazine a few years ago and provides a sort of visual representation of cyber doom, in this case a digital pixelated mushroom cloud, which also reminds us of our tendency sometimes to analogize cyber to nuclear weapons and nuclear attack or other kinds of WMD. But there are a number of potential harms to our ongoing use of such rhetoric in public policy debates about the nature and future of cyber conflict. First and foremost, and I think most obvious, is that these scenarios might just flat be unrealistic, right? They might be an incorrect diagnosis of the problems that we actually face. And in fact, on 2 occasions just last year in 2015, in February and again in September, Director of National Intelligence in the United States, James Clapper, said that such cyber Armageddon scenarios do not in fact reflect the real threat that we face. And he said, quote, and it's on the slide here as well, the likelihood of a catastrophic attack from any particular actor is remote at this time. Rather than a cyber Armageddon scenario that debilitates the entire U.S. infrastructure, we envision something different. We foresee an ongoing series of low to moderate level cyber attacks from a variety of sources over time, right? So the first thing to note here is the very fact that D&I Clapper felt the need to address the issue of cyber Armageddon twice in 1 year is itself an indicator of how prominent this rhetoric is in the public policy debate. Okay? He felt the need to say something about it under oath and in writing in his official statement to Congress twice in 1 year. But despite that, and as we note in the paper, this rejection of cyber doom has not put an end to the use of cyber doom rhetoric. Lawmakers, other intelligence officials, journalists, and others continue to warn of an impending cyber doom. So what negative impacts could this have beyond just, an incorrect diagnosis of the problem? So James Lewis from the Center for Strategic and International Studies has actually noted that some cybersecurity advocates have found these kinds of appeals to fear, well, appealing, right? Perhaps even beneficial for increasing awareness of and motivating a response to cybersecurity challenges that I think a lot of us feel like maybe have been ignored by the wider public and policymakers. But Lewis and others, and myself included, have argued that there are actually real potential harms to relying on such rhetoric that may outweigh whatever awareness-raising and motivation-inducing benefits that such rhetoric might have. So I think Lewis actually summed up these potential downsides best by warning that we risk a combination of simultaneous underreaction and overreaction to the cyber threats that we face. That is, we risk ignoring or underreacting to the real threats while overreacting to imaginary or exaggerated threats. So he warned as long ago as 2010 that, quote, appeals to emotions like fear can be more compelling than a rational discussion of strategy, but the danger is that the most likely outcomes are either overreaction or miscalculation, or a blasé dismissal of risk after hearing wolf cried too many times. Neither is preferable. Finally, many other scholars have also noted the tendency towards hyperbolic rhetoric. Myself and James Lewis are not the only ones in this regard. And some of these folks have even begun to draw from the work of communication scholars who have looked at the phenomenon of fear appeal messages, and in particular, the work of a rhetorician by the name of Douglas Walton has been sort of popular among a handful of cybersecurity scholars who have begun to look at the issue of fear appeals. So this sort of background was the basis for our research questions in the project that we undertook. And the first was whether these concerns about the impacts of fear appeal, about the potential for negative impacts of hyperbolic rhetoric exemplified by cyber doom scenarios, was actually supported by communication research on the effects of fear appeal messages. So the literature on fear appeals is much broader than what gets cited by scholars of cyber conflict. And in fact, in some cases, the arguments in the fear appeal literature have sort of been badly misconstrued by a couple of cybersecurity researchers. So we wanted to know, does the wider fear appeal literature and communication research actually support the concerns that some people have raised about the potential negative impacts of the use of cyber doom rhetoric and hypothetical scenarios in particular? And second, if it does, can we observe the expected effects in the wild, so to speak? So in our case, can we observe these effects in a particular audience responses to a particular cyber doom scenario? So the basic too long didn't read answer to these research questions is yes in both cases. First, even though some cyber conflict researchers have sort of misread and misappropriated the work of Douglas Walton in a couple of cases, nonetheless, the larger body of fear appeals research does support the concerns that they've raised about the potential negative effects of this rhetoric. Second, as we'll see in just a moment, audiences react in expected ways when presented with an over-the-top cyber doom scenarios. That is, they respond by either ignoring the message entirely or reacting in fatalistic or counterproductive kinds of ways. Okay, so the way that we approached these questions was in a two-phase process. The first was that we reviewed a wider body of existing communication research on fear appeals than what has typically been used in cybersecurity research to this point. In particular, we looked at the quantitative social science literature on fear appeals. This literature has mainly focused on the use of fear in health campaign messaging. So for example, trying to convince people to stop smoking or to wear their seatbelts, these sorts of things. However, the fear appeals approach has also been taken up more recently in the academic literature on information security. So the health communication research on fear appeals goes all the way back to like the 1950s and 1960s. Just in the last decade or so, information security researchers have begun to import some of the work from fear appeals into the work that they do, and this involves messaging to try to convince people to do things like, follow the company IT security policy, update your software, install antivirus. How do you convince people to take those kinds of actions? So the basic idea here was to start from a basis of what we already know. And so a theme at the conference that I've seen several times over the last couple days is that so much of the time in cyber conflict, we resort to hypothetical scenarios or just sort of pure imagination, speculation, or theorization. But we do have a base of knowledge from history, from social science, and elsewhere from which to draw to help us think about cybersecurity. And that's the case here as well. So existing research says that fear appeals are usually composed of 4 components, 2 threat components and 2 response components. That is, a communicator must convince the audience that the threat is harmful and that the listener is actually susceptible to that particular threat. The communicator should also communicate, however, that something can be done in response to the threat and that the listener is capable of carrying out that response. Existing research has shown consistently that use of fear can be helpful in raising awareness and motivating action. However, there's a caveat. More fear is not better. In fact, too much fear, especially in the absence of clear communication that there is an obtainable and effective response to the threat, can have the opposite effect, causing people to ignore the warning or react with fatalism or demotivation to act. That is, the threat and response components of a fear appeal message must be carefully balanced for the fear appeal to have productive effects. So our next step was to test whether we can see these kinds of effects in an audience exposed to a particular cyberdoom scenario. So for this phase, we focused on a National Geographic Channel docudrama that aired in October 2013. This show, called American Blackout, depicted what might happen in the event of a catastrophic cyber attack on the United States. Although the show was entirely fictional, it began with 2 epigraphs with some sort of scary sound effects and music in the background that was meant to communicate to the audience that though this was fictional, this kind of scenario is an entirely realistic thing. Okay, so we have some experts, this is based on expert imaginations and opinions here. So we started by conducting a rhetorical analysis of the show using the framework of the main components of fear appeal messaging. And we noted the degree to which the show emphasized the various components of fear appeals over other components. Next, to measure audience response, we collected tweets about the show using the hashtag American Blackout, which National Geographic was encouraging people to use. And we collected about 16,500 tweets over a period of about 12 to 13 hours during the evening that the show was running. After cleaning that data and removing a bunch of duplicates, non-English tweets, et cetera, we were left with about 3,500 tweets. 2 coders, the students in this case, content analyzed these tweets for a number of variables related to the fear appeal components and also what kind of responses people perceived in the show. So preventive responses that could be used either by individuals or government to prevent such a scenario, or responses to react to such a scenario were it to actually occur. And then one of the things we were most interested in is coding for expressions of fatalism or avoidance, right? So people saying, there's nothing we can do about this, or this is so scary, I'm going to turn it off. I don't even want to think about this. I don't want to watch this, right? These kinds of responses. And intercoder reliability was achieved for the content analysis of all the variables. So this slide shows the table from our paper that explains our code book, the definitions of the variables, and some example tweets. And it's kind of hard to read on here, but you can see more details in the full paper. Okay, so in our rhetorical analysis, we found that the program focuses entirely on the threat component of a fear appeal message with little, if any, explicitly recommended or even implied responses that individuals or government can take to effectively prevent or react to such a scenario. Electricity and basic social cohesion were depicted as one and the same in the show. So when the lights go out, society quickly, within like a couple of hours in this scenario, devolved into sort of a Lord of the Flies scenario. Our favorite scene was one guy killing another guy over a can of peaches, and I think this was like, less than 2 days into like the power being out. People are killing each other over canned goods, right? This framing was reflected in the results of our content analysis. So those who tweeted about the show were much more likely to tweet about the perceived susceptibility or severity of the threat than they were about the any perceived response mechanisms in the program. In fact, those who tweet, there were less than half as many tweets about particular responses than there were about perceptions of the threat itself, the severity and susceptibility to the threat. Of those who did tweet about potential responses, personal prepping was the most popular possible response that people tweeted about. And so that involves, sort of stockpiling food, water, guns, etc., which is sort of an antisocial and perhaps even counterproductive response in the grander scheme of things. So based on these findings and what we know from fear appeals research, one would expect that those who had heightened perceptions of threat would also have a higher tendency towards fatalism or avoidance. And indeed, this is what we found. Where perceptions of severity and susceptibility were absent, expressions of fatalism or avoidance were also low. Conversely, however, when perceptions of severity and susceptibility to the threat were higher, so too were expressions of fatalism and avoidance, right? So those are those responses that say, it's too scary, there's nothing we can do about it, this is inevitable, or it's too scary, I'm turning the TV off, I can't watch this. Right? These kinds of responses. Existing research on fear appeals indicates that messages that focus too much on the threat component to raise fear without balancing that with a response component, i.e. convincing audiences that there's something that can be done that will work to lessen the threat or its impact, that in these scenarios, people have a tendency to either avoid the message entirely or to act in a fatalistic manner. And that's sort of what we saw with our analysis. Now, this study certainly has its limitations. Ideally, we would like a much larger sample of tweets. Also, not all cyber doom rhetoric is so explicit as this particular scenario. So it's hard to generalize to all forms of cyber doom rhetoric, like the use of historical analogies or metaphors, such as the infamous cyber Pearl Harbor, especially when these kinds of references are used more in passing, instead of a speaker or a particular program really dwelling on them and laying out the details of what might be involved. Also, it's hard to know if this particular message was effective or not because it's not entirely clear what the intent of the messaging was. So if we judge this as a fear appeal, however, it would seem to have been a failure, right? If it was meant to communicate a threat and a response, it failed because neither we nor the audience perceived the existence of a recommended response in this particular fear appeal message. If the goal were to scare victims into passive inaction or acceptance of government action on cybersecurity, however, it was perhaps more successful as there was a strong correlation between perceptions of threat components and fatalism or avoidance. However, if the goal was to promote quiescence or passive support for government action, such a goal would clearly be categorized as an unethical communication or a fallacious appeal to authority by most communication scholars. Nonetheless, the study does help us to provide some justification for the current concerns that some have raised about the use of cyber doom rhetoric in general and frightening hypothetical scenarios in particular. A review of the larger body of communication research does indicate that concerns about potential negative impacts of fear appeals are warranted. Communicating fear appeals effectively and ethically is a balancing act. It is easy to get wrong. The result can be precisely what James Lewis and others have worried about: overreactions, underreactions, or inappropriate or counterproductive reactions. Our analysis of audience responses to the program American Blackout demonstrates that the effects expected from existing research can be observed in the case of a cyber doom scenario. That is, too much emphasis on fear or threat without sufficient messaging about effective and obtainable responses can lead to fatalism and avoidance in audiences. Some people believe that government should take the lead on cybersecurity and that we haven't done enough thus far and have left private organizations and individuals to fend for themselves. So Michael Hayden has, for example, made this argument in recent months. Others, on the other hand, argue that, in fact, we must have a decentralized response, that government cannot do it all. So, for example, Peter Singer sort of advances more of a public health kind of model of cybersecurity. Whatever the case, whether through neglect or as a primary policy response, private organizations and individuals must be motivated to act and to do more on cybersecurity in our current environment. Thus, for those of us who must communicate about cyber threats, we should implement a dictum based on Michael Pollan's advice about diet and food in his New York Times bestselling book, The Omnivore's Dilemma, which some of you may have read. And in that book, he says, eat food, not too much, mostly plants. In our case, when trying to raise awareness and motivate action on cyber threats, we might say instead, use fear, but not too much, focus on effective and obtainable responses. So communicating about cyber is vitally important. This was emphasized by the president of Estonia in his opening remarks to the conference. And in fact, Dr. Tim Stevens reiterated the importance of discourse as a form of productive power in his talk yesterday. Another recurrent theme at this conference has been looking to history and existing bases of related knowledge to guide us. So in the panel on power, we were encouraged to look at the long history of research on power to understand how power works in cyberspace. Dr. Ridd encouraged us this morning to look at the history of cybernetics, and Dr. Levicki encouraged us to look at the past theorizations of information warfare. Likewise, in communicating about cyber threats with policymakers and wider publics, there is existing knowledge in communication science that can guide us. With fear appeal, that work spans all the way from Aristotle up to recent experimental social science research, and we should look at that work. Again, this work is clear. More fear is not better. A little bit goes a long way and must be balanced, as Aristotle said, by buoying the courage of audiences to act. Fear alone cannot achieve that effect, and in fact, by itself, it might have exactly the opposite effect. Thanks.
Thank you, Sean. Leah will discuss the strategic Israeli approach to cyber power through the application of soft and hard power instruments. Leah is a scholar of cyber power at the Tel Aviv University Blavatnik Interdisciplinary Cyber Research Center and the director of cyber strategy with the consultancy firm of CSG. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. The ideas I will be presenting now, I have developed them in Tel Aviv University. I come from political science, from international relations and security studies scholarship. And now I am part of the newly established Interdisciplinary Cyber Research Center, which brings together about 250 people in the university from different perspectives. Part of the work that we do, as you can see, as I represent, is social science. Now, I personally love hacking. This is how I got here in the first place. I was doing IT security, IT administration, because I love hacking. I like it. It's usually a beautiful thing, but it creates risks, as we all know. That's why we are here. To mitigate these risks, we usually, at least from my experience, turn to seek more IT professionals, have the cryptography, better coding. Now a new thing, relatively new thing, is bigger and fatter cyber commands, counting heads of cyber warriors, and so on. We have been at it for decades now. This is not the earliest example, but this is from the 70s, 1970, the American Defense Science Board, which basically outlines all the vulnerabilities that we have going on today. The result is insecurity. It's actually very convenient to use the American example because they publish things unlike others. But this is this is, I think, the situation that we will all agree that security has not improved much. I try to explain why in my research, and I'll present part of it here. For that, I'll outline an analytical framework that I try to develop now, and I presented partly in the paper, framework of understanding cyber power. And afterwards, I applied to analyze the Israeli experience. Power, by definition, only manifests when it is applied in a conflict, usually, to achieve certain ends. Power is relational, as Dr. Stevens reminded us yesterday, told us the panel. And cyber power is no different in that principle. To create power, one needs strategy. Strategy, the best definition that I found is from a recent book by Lawrence Friedman, is the art of creating power. And the essence of strategy remains to find the correct relations between the ends that someone has to define and the ways and means that you use to achieve these ends. This is the sort of the theoretical part. And looking at our practice of cybersecurity, we too often focus on what here is marked in the red, on the tactics and the technology, which are important, and but they only get us this far. Throughout history, going back to the bodies of knowledge that exist in research, throughout history, superior means were never enough to succeed, to achieve a strategic success. You can win a battle here and there, but you cannot prevail. And I want to shift the focus on the higher level of strategy, the grand strategy of correlating better between the ends and the means. Now I turn to analyze strategy and power in action. This is the maps of Sykes-Picot from about a century ago. It was a pretty bad mess then. It's not much better today. And under this background, the ideology that driven the creation of Israel's establishment has pretty much remained the same. The ends are very much high level, establish, secure, and develop the state. And this is, for that, there was a strategy outlined. Some progress have been made, but importantly, the ends remain the same. If you ask anyone today that deals with security in Israel, they do fear for the very security in the state in the most direct sense. So the ends developed, the ends remain the same. The strategy to make the progress is the subject of much debate that is going on in the literature. It's probably underdeveloped now. This slide is taken from my book from last year, Cybersecurity in Israel, that I wrote together with Professor Ben Israel. This is a basic illustration of the grand strategy. You have the constraints, you have the goal, and you work out some strategic principles to not often articulate them, but one of them is to look for quality, because there's no way you can match the quantity of the land, the population, and so on. This principle has, I think it succeeded, and it is the same principle that we need to look for in cyber power. To secure the state, Israel continuously opts for qualitative advantage, and this is, as you understand, the major threat for the Israeli politicians in the last couple of decades. You can also go here to the idea of doom scenario, cyber doom, and threat inflation, but the fact is that this is the major threat. You can, and so it is should be relatively straightforward to argue that the same strategy guides the response to the major threat. You go out, you look for the best ways to achieve qualitative advantage, develop sophisticated, precision-guided cyber technology, and use it as a weapon to achieve the most important ends. This is regardless of the effectiveness of such results. This shows the correlation between the ends, what you want to achieve, and the means, what you choose to do. Stuxnet was a manifestation of of hard power and cyber power, but soft power is no less important. And in the recent couple of decades, information technology in general and cyber security in particular has been driving much of the economic growth, which is part of the cyber power, and other benefits that come with it. For example, cybersecurity, as we all know, is mostly a civilian issue rather than military, because we need to protect the whole society, not the military hardware usually. And in that case, in that context, you have very much importance of what's going on the civilian side of things. And the industry is developing really well, and it's also being deployed. For example, I think it's good to mention that since 2003, Israel has an arrangement for oversight of critical infrastructure protection, which is all civilian. It has nothing to do with the defense sector, that actually forces them to deploy all sorts of best practices to defend themselves. Because when in the 90s, let's say, the Israeli defense forces were looking at electronic warfare, information warfare, were all very excited about it. Then someone thought about it and realized that the only country in the region that can suffer from this thing is Israel itself. So there was a concerted effort to implement critical infrastructure protection in the civilian sector, which also drove much of the industry that we are seeing today. So to summarize, the main results of the analysis of this framework is to see that, to show that Israel exercises cyber technology for soft and hard power across the instruments of power. The military instrument of power is probably clear enough to apply it against the primary threat. In the couple of last years, the defense exports in Israel, which has always been high, are now second to the cyber exports. Cyber technology exports to the security, usually not to the government, to the civilian sector, it's not including government-to-government deals, are larger than the defense exports, which drives much of the economic growth. And according to Gartner estimates, the Israeli companies take about 8% of the global market. And as you know, which is far above the weight of this. So this is another result. It is another manifestation of potential for soft power, which mostly manifests in international cooperation that we see continuously both in the university and in government related things, and in business investments that pretty much every company that deals with cybersecurity has an R&D operation in Israel. These are not, so to recap, this may sound a bit like a promo for Israel. This is not. This is an analytical framework that I'm trying to develop, and I want to use the case to illustrate its usefulness. The key takeaway is why do you think, or do many people think, that Israel has cyber power? This is not about counting the exports or counting the attacks that someone carried out, not about counting the number of graduates in STEM and so on. This is about the ends, ways, means nexus, how things correlate and how they are driven by this some sort of overarching goal. To succeed in this realm of cyber power and cybersecurity, first of all, to succeed in cybersecurity, we need cyber power. The minimum thing is to protect the things that we already have. I think the appropriate thing that most will agree on is to be able to use cyber technology to achieve the goals that you have across the domains, across the instruments of power, regardless of what these goals may be. Most of them have to do with not with the military goals, but economic, social, and other stuff that the state has to provide its citizens. And this is the proper context of cyber power that I'm trying to advocate. I have, in this particular research, I have only used strategic studies and some of the economic literature on national innovation systems, how the state can facilitate better cooperation across the sectors of the society, something that's called the ecosystem of innovation. But this framework is open for much more different inputs from different disciplines. Our center at Tel Aviv University welcomes interdisciplinary research and international cooperation, and I hope that we will continue to progress in this important area of cybersecurity along with like-minded countries. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you. Oh. Thank you to the three presenters. That concludes the presentations. So now we go to the debating and question answer part. And as moderator, I reserve the right to ask the first question. That's all. It's actually the same question for both Sean and Steve, but from your own different perspectives. In the terrorist use of cyber capabilities and in the use of cyber terminologies by politicians in the US, how much of it is just basic opportunism, and how much is actually strategy? How much is it really deciding, thought out, pre-thought out use of cyber Armageddon terms, and not like Robert Work, who recently said we are dropping cyber bombs. It's kind of like, well, it sounds good, so I'll use it, and not really knowing what the hell it actually means, what he's talking about. So how much is opportunistic and how much is real strategy?
You want to go first?
Yeah, I can do the terrorism side. So how much is actual strategy versus opportunism? We have, I believe we pretty much, the terrorism studies have gotten to the point where we say the use of cyber by terrorists in terms of propaganda, exploitation, if you will, the propaganda, recruiting, command and control has pretty much been determined to be one of the strategies that they use to either widen their grip or to evade law enforcement measures. In terms of the actual use of cyber attack, thus far, one of the things about terrorist organizations is that they're not necessarily very innovative. They are very conservative when it comes to tactics that they use. They like to go back to what they know. They like security, they like things to go boom when they actually press the button. So cyber is one of those things that is an unknown. They haven't used it before a lot. So they are not an innovator, rather than they're more of they take what other people have done, so they look at other people who have done it and say, oh, look, that seems to have an effect. Let's try it out and see what happens. Perhaps that's why ISIL is the one prevalent organization, because it is currently the largest and primarily well-funded organization that's out there. So in terms of attacks and things like that, we think is primarily more opportunistic at this moment, and then the rest of it, use of internet for publications and things like that, are more of a strategy.
Yeah, so in terms of the messaging component of this, I'm not entirely sure what the proportion is between folks who use sort of over-the-top rhetoric consciously as a strategy, like they're actually thinking to themselves, okay, I'm going to frame it this way, and if I really scare people, then they're going to take me seriously, or they're going to support the policy proposals I'm pushing, or something like this. Or if it, on the other hand, what percentage of folks who use that rhetoric are just sort of doing it off the cuff, or they're not really thinking very consciously, about using that rhetoric. But I think part of, what we can learn from the work that we've done in our paper is kind of really doesn't matter if they're doing it consciously or not. These kinds of messages, these kinds of constructions can still have detrimental effects. Right? It's really not dependent on the intent of the person who is using it. So I would say one lesson that we could learn from this is, if you're the type of person who sort of throws around the cyber doom, willy-nilly without thinking about it, maybe be a little more conscious about what you're saying when you're communicating to policymakers or the media or wider public audiences, because the use of this kind of rhetoric can potentially backfire. It might not be getting you the results that you perhaps want to be getting. And if, there are folks who are consciously trying to ramp up the fear because they think that that is a good strategy. The lesson might be that not really, or at least some caveats which say fear can work, but it has to be part of a very clearly defined messaging strategy where you have to understand what the components are and they have to be balanced. And I think there's really a need for more research in this area of trying to figure out, what is the most effective way to communicate about cybersecurity issues to wider publics and get them interested and involved in taking some kind of an action. Because as Steve was saying, a lot of times, the issues that maybe make a lot of us afraid, right? We see issues of espionage and theft and the potential for physical attack, kinetic effects through cyber, although we haven't seen a lot of that in the real world, but the effect, the potentials are definitely there. And that scares a lot of us in this room, right? Because we understand those things. But to this point, cyber attacks have sort of lacked that dramatic effect that Steve's talking about from traditional terrorism. So in that case, we're faced with the dilemma of how do we communicate this threat to policymakers, to the media, and to wider publics in a way that is effective in getting their attention, raising awareness, and motivating people to act, but doesn't rely so much on fear that it motivates people to do the wrong thing, or it completely turns them off and causes them to put their heads in the sand and ignore what we're saying. So I think there's a real balancing act. Whether people are using this rhetoric intentionally or not, there's a balancing act we got to find.
And Leo, this balancing act for Israel, which of course always has this sense of urgency, this existential threat perception or reality, does that impact the way you communicate, the government communicates about the cyber threat?
I think sometimes they would like to use it intentionally, but perhaps unluckily, cyber threat is not among the top issues on the security agenda, so it takes a much less prominent position on the public debate regarding security. So it's basically nuclear power, diplomatic relations with the rest of the world, and terrorism.
Okay, thank you. Well, now, the floor, please. Anyone has a question? There are microphones coming up. Everyone. Oh, first we'll go back. Yeah.
Thank you. Daniel Moore, King's College London, and VeriSign iDefense. This is a question for Steve. So we see on a daily basis hundreds of attacks that are affiliated rather loosely with collectives of hacktivists that self-identify as being a part of a violent extremist group online. This could be the so-called cyber caliphate, or it could be the Saudi offshoot of Anonymous. But this is usually constricted to defacement-style events. And I'm wondering if you do incorporate those kind of events into your scope and call those attacks, doesn't it muddle a bit the discourse that you have on it? And if so, what is the threshold of attack as you see it for your own research?
Okay, I'll give it a go. So we in our research we did include defacements and such of that nature as a threshold. So basically, anything above, actually, what we normally know as cyber attacks, like defacement of websites, DDoS attacks. So we have incorporated all that into our attack model. The one thing that we were trying to do in our collection phase to discern whether an attack was actually by or on behalf of organization was a little bit more difficult, because there are a lot of attacks that somebody will do it and say, oh, we did it because we support ISIL. But they actually, if you do some digging, they actually have no real connection to ISIL in any way, shape, or form. So there were some of that difficulty that we did. But so once we were pretty confident that we could delineate, yes, this organization conducted the attack on behalf, in either as a direction from ISIL or whatever organization we were looking at, or because they are actually affiliated as part of that organization, the numbers were still pretty low. So if we, actually, Reiner, if we included the attacks that were claimed to be because we're supporting the electronic jihad, for example, for openly, just saying it, then we actually did not include those in our data set because we could not attribute that to any actual organization.
Another question there.
Thank you. Kristen Stoddart, Aberystwyth University. I'm also a social scientist and IR person. I'm also part of a project team, which I described yesterday at another panel. We look at CNI, critical national infrastructure, particularly SCADA systems, and industrial control systems as an attack vector. I work with 2 members from industry, which is Airbus, and 5 computer scientists. So it's a fairly large project. And we've been doing it for quite a while, and I go to a lot of industry conferences, and what we tend to find is problems and problem areas, multiple attack vectors, major question marks against infrastructure and protection of infrastructure, and that ranges from physical hardware through to people, the low-hanging fruit, people always being the weak link. And I'm afraid to say, I think the cyber doom scenario, which you're skeptical about, I think it's a little bit, I don't think we can dismiss it. And I'd be careful of that. But at the same time, I'm slightly agreeing with you because I think the level of policy debate has not been great, and it still isn't great. I think the awareness is lacking for whatever reason. I think partly because computer science doesn't always translate itself well to policymakers. And that translation process is something we can help with, I hope anyway. I don't really have a question besides that, except to say, our team worries about threats all the way through from terrorists and lone wolves, all the way through to major state-based events. And I think across that spectrum, there are dangers, possibilities, worries, concerns. I'd like to think that the cyber doom scenarios are unrealistic. I'm not so sure. I'm just not so sure.
Yeah. So a couple of responses to that. So the first is to say, you know, I'm not the only one, and even James Clapper is not the only one to sort of try to put the brakes on the doom rhetoric. In fact, I did a paper several years ago for another publication, an engineering publication, actually on an industrial control system cybersecurity. I'm not entirely sure why they asked me to write for that particular book, but what I looked at was sort of official assessments of the threat over time and the degree to which critical infrastructure figured prominently or not in official US assessments, and actually was surprised to find that when you look at like major policy speeches and major strategy documents, et cetera, critical infrastructure does not show up as much as you would expect in US policy documents. And you get you know, statements as far back as 2008 with the big report from CSIS basically saying, we used to think the threat was critical infrastructure, dams, you know, opening, stuff exploding, but now we know it's really informational, it's theft of information, right? So, so a lot of people have been saying this, and critical infrastructure has sort of fallen off, at least during the Obama administration, as one of the major concerns in the key policy documents when you go and you sort of code them for what is the target of the threat that you guys were talking about, right? What do we perceive to be the target of the threat? But even beyond that, whether or not that assessment is correct or not, right, I'm still interested in the effect that hyperbolic rhetoric can have, right? Because the rhetoric can have effects independent of whether or not it's correct or not, right? And so even if the threat might really be cyber doom, what the social science research on fear appeal messaging tells us is, even if it's a real threat, if you communicate it in the wrong way, you can still have counterproductive results, right? So at some level, it doesn't even really matter whether it's the real threat or not, because the way you communicate it can still have negative impacts.
Yeah, and actually to follow up on that a little bit, it's a little bit of a different example, but so the radiological and nuclear terrorism cases, we have, the US government has had the exact same problem, radiological and nuclear terrorism, very high consequence event, but extremely low probability. But usually what happens is you go to either the local or the state responders and you say, how are you preparing for eventuality this may happen? Usually the response is, oh, I'm not going to deal with it, we're going dead. Well, that is not productive. So I think there's a point there. In the cyber world, we can't get there. I mean, the US government has spent a lot of money and a lot of effort to reverse that trend so that the state and local can go, oh, there are some things we can do to prepare our citizens and ourselves for this. So I think cyber world can't actually follow the RN model, and we should avoid an RM model and actually go forward in a productive manner.
Yes, here front.
Rob Walker, U.S. Department of Energy. Lior, I'm going to direct this to you at first because I think Israel's kind of a unique position here. It has a very high concentration of the population within its borders, and you guys have an incredibly high participation in the defense forces. Does Israel currently conduct, or does it plan to in the future, any kind of exercises or drills should there be a major doomsday scenario cyber attack? Let's restrict it to communication infrastructure. Do the Israeli security forces know where to go and prepare for a physical attack in conjunction with, or how to show up to work should communications blackout occur at some point?
Okay, so the short answer is yes. The long answer is much more complicated because of the substantial ethical and moral issue of involving the defense forces in the protection of the civilian critical infrastructure. This has been and remains one of the issues that I think stifles cybersecurity everywhere. The defense forces have a lot of capability, and usually if something major happens, they will have to do something. But in practice, it is not their responsibility, and they don't have access. For that, you have since 2003, you have an authority that guides, which is a nice word to say, forces, utilities to do things that this authority tells them to do, to buy stuff, to train people, to have resilience and so on. And actually, it has been going since 2003, but in 2011 strategy, it was deemed not enough, because this authority is placed in the Shabak, in the Israeli security agency, the internal service, which presents another ethical and political issue of having intelligence services sitting inside the networks of critical infrastructure, including the financial sector. The financial sector is not under their supervision. And now there is a transition of this authority to a new agency. And I think we all know how these things work when you transition something from one agency to another. It remains to be seen. But I would say the focus of the policy is now looking beyond the critical infrastructure, because this is sort of regulated. We sort of know who is responsible for what. It's a joint responsibility of the operators, the private sector, and the authorities. But because of the development of technology, there's so much interconnectedness going on that the focus of the policy is to seek a national comprehensive resilience, so to speak. So it's no longer the focal point of the efforts. It's kind of a second order problem now, because we've been dealing this for quite a few years now.
For the American gentleman, do you foresee any policy initiatives in the near future for the United States government, and especially agencies that are in charge of responding to this type of disaster or attack, making any kind of, even from messaging to a concerted plan to a national level exercise?
I wouldn't expect anything big to happen in the next, year or two. I mean, with the election coming up, right, everything comes to a stop and nothing happens. So yeah, I don't see anything happening big on that front. I mean, it took how many years to get CISA, right, the Cyber Security Information Sharing and Awareness Act passed, and it's pretty weak in terms of like what it really does, right? So. And it took a long time, and it only got passed because so much of any sort of teeth were cut out of it in terms of any kind of like regulations or standards or for industry or anything like that. So, and the current political climate, I don't see anything happening soon. I don't know.
Yeah, I agree with that assessment. Especially in terms of the threat side of things. We tend to look at the next brightest light. Currently, the ISO has that spot. So if we're going to have any policy comes out, that's more than likely going to be geared towards countering that particular threat rather than threat as a holistic whole. So, and given our political season that we're in, probably nothing substantial is going to happen in the near future.
I think we have time for one more question over there. It's on the other side.
Namık Kaplan, Turkish Armed Forces. Yeah, my question maybe to Steve, but any member, panel member can answer. So I like your work, public, private, and academic. So concerns, if you combine 3 of them, so it makes the national security concerns. So my question would be national security point of view. So Syrian Electronic Army executes cyber attacks to Turkey. And besides that, we receive legacy, mortars, shells coming from Syria to Turkey. So that's, cyber war with the kinetic war. So you haven't touched in your work, but how do you define the relation between two? Can you elaborate on that? Thank you.
Okay. So our center, actually, this is where I fall back onto our center's charter as an excuse. But our center was actually chartered to look at non-state actors specifically. So if in this particular work, we collected data on Syrian Electronic Army's activities, but if they conducted cyber warfare against Turkey, for example, on behalf of the government of Syria, that is not included in our set. So we have the information, but that's not used in the research. So that's one of the things that we do, is that so state-to-state activities are not something that we look at normally unless there is a need, or during the research, there may be some need for us to look at state-to-state activities because they do it through a proxy such as Syrian Electronic Army. So if that is the case, then we may look at it, but for this particular data sets, those are not included in the data set itself, but we do have the information for those.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. I think with that we can conclude this session, and with this diverse lot of presentation, I think we came up with a coherent session, so thank you very much for that. That leads me to hand you over our present, and as you all have to go to the necessary security checks, rest assured there are no hemp seats in there, so this should be all very safe. Again,
Yeah.
thank you very much for your contribution.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.